People often ask me what goes through my mind when I'm standing backstage watching the monitors just moments before I walk out to meet a family in crisis. They assume I'm looking at the talking points or checking my notes, but the truth is I'm looking at the eyes. The eyes never lie. You can fake a smile, you can put on a designer dress that costs more than a mid-sized sedan, and you can rehearse your opening statement until you're blue in the face, but the eyes will tell you exactly how close to the edge you really are. And when I looked at the monitors today, watching this young woman named Tiffany pacing in the green room, checking her reflection in her phone, every 30 seconds I saw someone who wasn't just disconnected from reality, she had divorced it, moved 3 states away, and left no forwarding address. We are talking about a 26-year-old woman who is drowning in debt, dragging her parents down into financial ruin with her, and yet she walked onto my stage looking like she was ready for a photo shoot on the cover of Vogue. That disconnect, that absolute refusal to acknowledge the gravity of the situation is usually the first sign that we aren't just dealing with a spending problem. We are dealing with a profound crisis of identity and self-worth masked by layers of entitlement that have hardened like concrete over the years. When I sat down to read the briefing on this family, I have to tell you it gave me pause. I've seen everything. I've seen gambling addictions, I've seen shopping compulsions, I've seen financial infidelity between spouses, but the sheer volume of consumption here, the velocity at which Tiffany was burning through her parents' retirement savings was staggering. We aren't talking about essentials. We aren't talking about medical bills or student loans or keeping the lights on. We are talking about luxury vacations, high-end handbags, cosmetic procedures, and a lifestyle that frankly 99% of the population can't afford, let alone someone with zero income. And that's the kicker, zero income. She hasn't held a job in 3 years, yet she spends $10,000 a month. You do the math. That money is coming from somewhere, and that somewhere is the rapidly depleting life savings of her parents, frantic, terrified, and completely unable to say the word no. My producer told me before the show that Tiffany sees herself as a victim in this narrative. She believes her family is controlling, stingy, and unsupportive of her vision. That's a word she uses a lot, her vision. She claims she's building a brand, that she's an influencer in the making, and that this hemorrhage of cash is merely an initial investment in a future empire. It's a common delusion I see these days, this idea that you can manifest success by simply dressing the part regardless of the financial crater you leave in your wake. But what struck me most wasn't her delusion, it was her parents' complicity. You cannot have a leech without a host. Robert and Linda, her parents are good people. I could see that immediately. They worked hard, they saved, they played by the rules. But somewhere along the line, they confused love with provision. They stopped parenting and started purchasing. And now they are sitting on a powder keg, watching the fuse burn down, terrified that if they cut her off, she'll cut them out of her life. That is the leverage she holds. That is the weapon she points at their heads. Give me what I want, or I will withdraw my affection. It is emotional blackmail, plain and simple, and it is one of the most toxic dynamics a family can endure. I wanted to start this conversation by understanding the history, the backstory of how a sweet little girl turns into a financial predator. Because kids aren't born this way. You don't come out of the womb demanding a Gucci belt. This is a learned behavior. It is conditioned. As I walked out onto the stage and the audience applause died down, I looked at Robert and Linda. They sat huddled together, looking small, looking defeated. Across from them sat Tiffany, chin up, legs crossed, radiating a defensive hostility that you could feel in the back row. I started with the parents because I needed to understand the architecture of this disaster. I asked them simply, "Why are you here?" Linda grabbed a tissue before she even spoke. She told me they were drowning. She told me they had postponed their retirement indefinitely. She told me that every time the phone rings, her heart stops because she thinks it's a debt collector or Tiffany asking for another bailout. I turned to Tiffany. I wanted to hear her side just as she requested. I looked her in the eye and asked, "Do you believe you are out of control?" Her answer was immediate, rehearsed, and chillingly calm. She said, "No, doctor. Phil, I believe I have expensive taste and big dreams, and my parents are trying to clip my wings because they don't understand the modern world." She truly believed that. She looked at me as if I were the one who didn't get it. She started explaining the concept of investing in oneself using buzzwords she'd likely picked up from social media, trying to intellectualize what was essentially greed. She talked about image maintenance, about networking, about how she couldn't possibly get a regular 9-to-5 job because it would damage her brand. I let her talk. Sometimes the best way to expose the absurdity of a situation is to simply let it breathe. I let the audience hear it. I let her parents hear it. And most importantly, I let her hear herself, hoping that maybe, just maybe, the sound of her own entitlement might trigger some spark of self-awareness. But as she spoke, I realized we were dealing with a deep-seated emotional void. I asked her about her childhood. I wanted to know when the gift started replacing the connection. It turned out Robert traveled a lot for business when Tiffany was young. Linda was overwhelmed with 2 other children. Guilt became the currency of the household. If Dad missed a birthday, he made up for it with a pony. If Mom was too tired to play, she bought a video game. They taught her that "I love you" looks like a credit card receipt. They taught her that her value was external, attached to things, to status, to appearance. And now, 20 years later, they were shocked that she was operating exactly according to the programming they installed. This is what I call the guilt-gift cycle. The parents feel guilty for not being present, so they buy things. The child learns to manipulate that guilt to get things. The parents feel resentful about the manipulation, but they give in to avoid conflict. The child feels empty because the things don't actually satisfy the need for connection, so they demand more things. It is a hamster wheel of misery, and nobody was getting off. I pulled up the graphics on the big screen. I believe in data. You can argue with opinions, but you can't argue with math. We put up a chart showing her spending over the last 12 months versus her income. The income column was a flat line at 0. The spending column looked like the skyline of Manhattan. $30,000 on clothes, $15,000 on travel, $8,000 on personal grooming, whatever that means. The audience gasped. I heard the audible intake of breath. It is one thing to say I spend a lot, and it is another thing to see the numbers in black and white towering over you. I watched Tiffany's face. She didn't flinch. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked annoyed. She looked at the screen and said, "Well, looking at it like that is unfair. You're not showing the potential return on investment." I had to stop her there. "Tiffany," I said, leaning in, "there is no return on investment for a trip to Cabo San Lucas that you took 3 months ago. That money is gone. It is ash. You drove a luxury car off a cliff and you're telling me you're just parking it?" She rolled her eyes. That gesture, that dismissal, told me that she wasn't just entitled, she was insulated. She had never felt the cold wind of consequence. Not once in her life had the check actually bounced. Not once had the lights actually gone out. Her parents had been standing between her and reality like a human shield, taking all the hits, absorbing all the blows, and she was standing behind them complaining that they weren't moving fast enough. I turned back to Robert. "Robert," I said, "you're a businessman. If you had an employee who produced 0 revenue, embezzled company funds, and insulted management, what would you do?" He looked down at his hands, wringing them together until the knuckles were white. "I'd fire them," he whispered. "So why," I asked, "have you not fired your daughter from the position of CEO of your bank account?" He looked up and I saw the tears welling. "Because she's my baby," he said. "And I'm afraid if I cut her off, she'll starve. She doesn't know how to survive." There it was, the enabler's lament. The belief that saving them from the lesson is an act of love, when in reality it is an act of sabotage. By preventing her from failing, they were preventing her from learning how to succeed. They were crippling her, keeping her in a state of permanent adolescence, and then resenting her for not acting like an adult. I looked at Robert, a man who had built a successful business from the ground up, a man who commanded respect in the boardroom, and I saw a hostage. He was a hostage in his own home, held captive not by guns or ropes, but by a twisted sense of obligation and a paralyzing fear of his daughter's rejection. She won't starve, Robert, I told him, my voice dropping an octave, trying to anchor him in reality. Hunger is a very powerful motivator. In the history of the world, very few able-bodied 26-year-olds have starved to death because their parents stopped paying for their acrylic nails. She will figure it out. But right now, she doesn't have to figure it out because you are figuring it out for her. I needed to peel back the layers of this dynamic to show them the ugliness underneath. We had sent cameras to their home a week prior to document a typical day, and what we captured was nothing short of psychological warfare. I turned to the audience and said, I want you to see what happens when the word no is introduced into this environment. We played the tape on the giant monitors. The polished, poised Tiffany sitting across from me vanished. In her place was a screaming, stomping whirlwind of rage. The footage showed her standing in her parents' kitchen, a beautiful kitchen, by the way, that she contributed nothing to screaming at her mother because Linda had refused to co-sign a lease for a luxury apartment downtown. Tiffany wasn't just arguing, she was verbally eviscerating the woman who gave her life. She called her mother useless, jealous, and pathetic. She threw a coffee mug into the sink, shattering it. The audio was filled with bleeps, but the venom was crystal clear. Back in the studio, the silence was heavy. You could hear a pin drop. Linda was weeping silently, her head bowed in shame. Robert was staring at the floor. But Tiffany, I watched her reaction closely. She was watching herself on the screen, not with embarrassment, but with a critical eye, as if she were checking her lighting. When the clip ended, she turned to me, shrugged, and said, I was frustrated. They promised to support my career, and then they reneged. That's gaslighting, Doctor. Phil, they made me crazy. That is not gaslighting. I shot back, leaning forward in my chair. That is a temper tantrum. That is a grown woman acting like a toddler because she didn't get the candy bar at the checkout line. And let's be very clear about something, Tiffany. You aren't angry because they lied to you. You are angry because they set a boundary. And boundaries are like kryptonite to a narcissist. I use that word deliberately. I don't throw clinical terms around lightly, but the lack of empathy I was witnessing, the grandiosity, the exploitation of others, it ticked every single box. She viewed her parents not as human beings with needs and feelings, but as appliances. When a toaster doesn't give you toast, you get mad at it. That's how she saw them. They were malfunctioning ATMs. I turned my attention back to the parents because, frankly, Tiffany wasn't ready to hear me yet. You can't reason with entitlement until you break the structure that supports it. Linda, I said softer this time. I want you to tell me about the credit cards, the ones you didn't open. Linda looked terrified. She glanced at Tiffany, then back at me. This was the secret they were hiding, the escalation that took this from a family dispute to a potential felony. She memorized my social security number, Linda whispered. She opened 3 cards in my name. She maxed them out in 2 months, $20,000. The audience groaned. This was the betrayal. This was the moment where spoiled turned into predatory. I looked at Tiffany. Is that true, I asked. She didn't deny it. She rationalized it. I intended to pay them back, she said, waving a hand dismissively. My brand was about to take off. I had a sponsorship deal in the works. It was a bridge loan, essentially. If they had just given me the money up front, I wouldn't have had to do it behind their backs. So really, they forced my hand. I had to take a moment. I took a deep breath, looked at the camera, then looked back at her. Let me get this straight. I said, my voice steady but hard as granite. You committed identity theft, you committed fraud against your own mother, and your logic is, look what you made me do. That is the logic of an abuser, Tiffany. That is exactly what a batterer says to his victim. If you had just had dinner on the table, I wouldn't have had to hit you. You are abusing these people financially and emotionally. She bristled at that. The word abuser cracked the veneer. I am not an abuser, she snapped. I love them. I just want them to believe in me. Love is a verb, I told her. Love is an action. Stealing your mother's identity is not an act of love. Screaming at her until she cries is not an act of love. Bleeding your father's retirement dry so you can look rich on Instagram is not an act of love. It is parasitic. You are feeding off them. I stood up and walked over to the board where I like to draw diagrams. I needed to show them the cycle they were trapped in. I drew a big circle. At the top, I wrote demand. Tiffany makes a demand, I explained, pointing to the top. Then I drew an arrow clockwise. Robert and Linda say no. I wrote resistances. Then another arrow. Tiffany escalates. She screams, she cries, she threatens to cut off contact, or in this case, she steals. I wrote punishment. Then the final arrow leading back to the top. Robert and Linda surrender to stop the pain. They pay the bill, they forgive the theft. I wrote compliancy. This, I said, tapping the board hard with my marker, is the wheel of misfortune. And every time you go around this circle, the behavior gets worse. Why? Because you are teaching her that if she screams loud enough, if she hurts you bad enough, you will fold. You are rewarding the terrorism. You are negotiating with a terrorist in your own living room. Robert looked up at the diagram and I saw the light bulb go on. He saw the pattern. He saw that his kindness was actually the fuel for the fire. We just wanted peace, he said, his voice cracking. I know I said walking back to sit in front of him. I know you want peace, but you are buying peace at a price you cannot afford. And the peace you are buying is fake. It's a ceasefire while she reloads. You aren't helping her, Dad. You are crippling her. You are robbing her of the most important lesson a human being can learn, cause and effect. If she spends money she doesn't have, the consequence should be debt and discomfort, but you step in and remove the consequence, so she learns that physics doesn't apply to her. She learns that gravity is just a suggestion. And let me tell you, the world is waiting for her out there with a baseball bat. The real world doesn't care about her brand. The IRS doesn't care about her vision. If she pulls this stunt with a stranger, she goes to jail. Are you prepared to visit your daughter in prison because you didn't have the guts to stop her now? That hit home. The word prison hung in the air. Tiffany crossed her arms, looking away, looking at the exit sign, looking anywhere but at the truth. She was starting to feel the heat. The audience wasn't on her side. I wasn't on her side. And for the first time, she could feel her parents wavering. That isolation is crucial. It's the pressure cooker we need to create a breakthrough, but she still had one card to play, the card she always played when she felt cornered, the victim card. You're all ganging up on me, she said, her voice trembling, forcing a tear. You don't know how hard it is. The pressure on social media is intense. I have to look a certain way. I have to compete. I have anxiety. I have depression. Shopping is how I cope. It's my therapy. She looked at me with those big wet eyes, waiting for the sympathy to roll in. It's a move that probably worked on every boyfriend, every teacher, and certainly her parents for her entire life. I wasn't buying it. I leaned in, resting my elbows on my knees. Tiffany, I don't doubt you have anxiety, I said. I'd be anxious too if I was living a lie. I'd be anxious too if I knew I was a fraud who couldn't pay for my own lunch. But do not confuse coping with self-medicating. You are using spending like a drug. You get a high when you swipe that card. You feel powerful, you feel important, but then the bill comes and the high crashes and you feel empty again. So you have to buy more. It is an addiction. And just like a heroin addict needs a fix, you need a transaction. But here's the cold hard truth. Your parents are your dealers. And today, the pharmacy is closing. I signaled to my producers. It was time to bring out the reality check. We had contacted the creditors. We had contacted the bank. I had a folder in my hand that contained the grim reality of their financial future if nothing changed. I opened the folder and pulled out a sheet of paper. Robert, Linda, I said, holding it up. My team ran the numbers based on your current burn rate. You are both 62 years old. If you continue to support Tiffany at this level, you will be bankrupt in exactly 18 months. You will lose the house, you will lose the retirement fund, you will be greeting people at Walmart to buy groceries. I handed the paper to Robert. Look at that number. That is your expiration date. Robert stared at the paper. His hands shook. He showed it to Linda. She gasped, covering her mouth. The abstract fear was now concrete math. They were staring into the abyss. Tiffany tried to snatch the paper to see, but Robert pulled it away. It was a small gesture, a tiny reclamation of power, but it was significant. 18 months, Robert muttered. We worked 40 years for this. And she has consumed it in 3, I added. She is eating your future to pretend she has a present. This was the tipping point. The studio lights felt hotter, the air thicker. You could see the realization washing over Robert and Linda, transforming their fear into a quiet, desperate resolve. But Tiffany, she was scrambling. Her world built on the shifting sands of her parents' compliance was starting to tilt. She saw them looking at that paper, the death warrant of their financial security, and she knew instinctively that her supply line was threatened. That's an exaggeration, Tiffany blurted out, her voice rising, losing its composed influence or cadence. Dr. Phil, your team doesn't know my potential earnings. I have a launch next month. I'm going to make 6 figures in the first quarter alone. I can pay them back tenfold. I turned to her not with anger, but with a flat clinical skepticism. Tiffany, stop, I said, holding up a hand. Just stop. We investigated your business. My team looked at your online presence. You have 4,000 followers. Your engagement rate is less than 1%. You are selling a course on lifestyle design that nobody has bought, not one person. You are selling ice to Eskimos and the Eskimos aren't buying. You are not a business. You are a hobby, and an incredibly expensive one at that. To bet your parents' survival on a fantasy that has produced $0 in 3 years isn't just irresponsible, it's delusional. I let that hang there. The word delusional is heavy, but sometimes you have to drop the anvil. She looked stunned. Nobody had ever told her the truth about her career before. Her friends likely enabled her, her parents placated her, and the internet. Well, the internet is an echo chamber. But here, under the bright lights, the math was undefeated. I shifted gears. I needed to move from diagnosis to surgery. I needed to cut the cord. Robert, Linda, I said, turning back to the parents, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You love your daughter, I know that. But you are loving her to death. You are loving her into incompetence. If you were to drop dead of a heart attack right now, God forbid what would happen to her. Linda sobbed. She wouldn't make it. She'd end up on the street. Exactly, I said. So your current plan is to keep her on life support until you die and then let her crash. That is not a plan. That is a tragedy in slow motion. You have to save her by letting her fall while you are still here to watch but not to catch. I could see the terror in their eyes. The idea of saying no was terrifying because they feared the backlash. They feared the rage we saw on that video. But how Robert asked, his voice trembling, she screams. She threatens. She says she'll kill herself. The room went cold, the suicide threat. It is the nuclear option of emotional manipulation. I took a very serious tone. Now, we take any threat of self-harm seriously, I said, looking straight into the camera and then back at them. But we also recognize when it is being used as a hostage negotiation tactic. If she threatens self-harm, you do not give her a credit card. You call 911. You call the professionals. You do not treat mental health crises with retail therapy. If she is truly in danger, she needs a hospital, not a handbag. If she is manipulating you, calling the ambulance will call her bluff very quickly. You cannot be held hostage by terror. Tiffany looked furious now. I had disarmed her biggest weapon. I never said that she lied, though I could see in her eyes she knew she had used it as leverage before. We have the text messages, Tiffany, I said, calmly pointing to the stack of evidence my producers had prepared. I have text here where you say, if you don't send me $500 right now, I might as well just end it. That is manipulation. That is cruel. And it stops today. I leaned forward, looking deep into Robert's eyes. Robert, I want you to look at your daughter. Look at her. He turned his head slowly. Tiffany glared back defiant. Tell her I urged him. Tell her the bank is closed. Tell her you are done. Robert swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. He looked at his wife, who nodded through her tears, giving him permission to be strong. He turned back to Tiffany. Tiffany, he started, his voice weak. Louder, I coached him. Like you mean it. Like your life depends on it, because it does. Tiffany, he said, stronger this time, I can't do this anymore. We are broke, we are scared, and I am not giving you another dime. Not for rent, not for gas, not for food, nothing. Tiffany's jaw dropped. She looked at her mother. Mom, are you going to let him do this to me? Linda took a deep breath, grabbed Robert's hand, and said, he's right, honey, we're done. We love you, but we're done paying. The explosion I expected didn't happen immediately. Instead, there was a vacuum of shock. Tiffany sat there blinking, processing a reality she had never encountered before. The ATM had just displayed insufficient funds for the first time in her life. Then came the anger, but it was different this time. It wasn't the confident rage of the kitchen video. It was the desperate, flailing panic of a child. You can't do this. I have bills due next week. I'll be evicted. Then get a job, I interjected, my voice cutting through her panic like a knife. McDonald's is hiring. Starbucks is hiring. You are young, you are healthy, you have a college degree that they paid for. There is no reason you cannot work. Is it glamorous? No. Is it beneath you? Absolutely not. Work is dignity. Earning your own dollar is the best feeling in the world. Spending someone else's is just theft with permission. She looked at me with pure hatred. I can't work a minimum wage job. It's humiliating. What is humiliating, I countered, is being 26 years old and stealing your mother's identity because you're too lazy to earn a paycheck. That is humiliation. Flipping burgers to pay your own rent, that is honor. That is adulthood. You have your definitions backward. I knew we were at the precipice. This was the moment where she would either storm off stage or break down. I've seen guests rip off the microphone and storm out the back door. I've seen them attack their parents. I was ready for anything. But I also knew that deep down under the layers of entitlement, there was a terrified little girl who knew she was incompetent. She knew she was a fraud, and she was exhausted from keeping up the charade. I don't know how she whispered, her voice barely audible. The defiance cracked. The posture slumped. I don't know how to do anything else. This is all I know. That was the breakthrough. It wasn't a roar, it was a whimper. It was the admission of total helplessness. I know, I said, my voice softening instantly. The drill sergeant was gone. The doctor was back. I know you're scared. You've been riding a bike with training wheels your whole life, and we just kicked them off. You think you're going to crash, and you might. You might wobble. You might scrape your knee. But Tiffany, you will never learn to ride if we don't let go. I stood up and walked over to her. I sat on the edge of her chair, invading her space, but in a supportive way. I am not here to destroy you, I told her. I am here to wake you up. You are sleepwalking off a cliff. I want to offer you a lifeline, but it is not money. I am not going to give you a cent, and neither are they. I turned to the audience. I have made some calls. I announced I have arranged for Tiffany to go to a specialized program. It is not a spa. It is not a resort. It is a work immersion and behavioral therapy center. You will live in a dorm. You will have chores. You will work a real job within the program. You will learn budgeting. You will learn conflict resolution. And you will have zero access to social media. No phone, no Instagram, no audience. Tiffany looked horrified. No phone, I confirmed. You need a detox. You are addicted to the validation of strangers. We need to replace that with self-respect. You will stay there for 90 days. If you complete the program, if you graduate, I have a career counselor ready to help you find legitimate employment in a field that actually pays. But here is the deal, Robert. Linda, if she leaves the program one day early, if she walks out, you change the locks on the house. You block her number. You cut her off completely. Do we have a deal? Robert and Linda nodded vigorously. They saw the life raft. Yes, Robert said, we'll do it. I looked at Tiffany. This is your chance, I said. You can walk out that door right now and go back to your empty apartment and wait for the eviction notice. Or you can get on the plane tonight and start building a life that is actually yours. A life you own. Which is it going to be? She looked at her parents. She saw the wall they had finally built. She looked at me and saw that I wasn't bluffing. She looked at her hands manicured with money she didn't earn. The silence stretched for an eternity. The audience held its breath. Finally, a tear rolled down her cheek. A real tear, not a performance. I'll go, she said softly. The audience erupted. Robert and Linda burst into tears and reached for her, but I held them back for a second. Not yet, I signaled. We aren't done. I needed to make sure this stuck. I needed to solidify the contract. Tiffany, you are going to hate me for the first 2 weeks, I told her. You are going to hate the food. You are going to hate the work. You are going to cry yourself to sleep wanting your phone. But around week 4, you are going to wake up and realize that the sun came up even though you didn't post about it. You are going to realize that you survived. And by week 12, you are going to look in the mirror and see a woman, not a dependent. You are going to see Tiffany, not the brand. And that woman will be strong enough to stand on her own 2 feet. I let her parents hug her then. It was a messy, tearful hug, but it felt different. It wasn't the hug of enablers buying peace. It was the hug of parents saying goodbye to a child so she could return as an adult. It was a goodbye to the dynamic that was killing them all. The final segment of the show is usually where we wrap things up with a nice bow, but life rarely works that way. I wanted to make sure the audience understood that the real work was just beginning. Tiffany agreeing to go was a victory, yes, but it was just the first step of a marathon. I turned back to the camera for my closing thoughts, the studio lights dimming slightly to focus the attention. Folks, I said what you saw today is an epidemic in this country. We have a generation of young adults who have been given everything except the tools to survive. We have parents who are so afraid of their children's discomfort that they are robbing them of their competence. You cannot love your children out of reality. Reality always wins. And if you stand between your child and the consequences of their actions, you are not protecting them. You are preparing them for failure. I looked over at the family one last time. Tiffany was wiping her eyes, looking terrified but resigned. Robert and Linda looked exhausted like they had just run a gauntlet, which in a way they had. Robert, Linda, I said, this is going to be hard for you too. When she calls you crying from the center because she has to scrub a toilet, your instinct will be to rescue her. You will want to drive down there and pick her up. If you do that, you are signing her financial death warrant. You have to be strong enough to let her struggle. The struggle is where the character is built. They nodded. I could see the fear lingering, but the resolve was there. They had stared into the abyss of bankruptcy, and that fear was finally greater than the fear of Tiffany's anger. That is the leverage we needed. After the taping, I walked backstage. The adrenaline of the show fades quickly, replaced by the weight of the responsibility. I spoke to the producers to ensure the transport was ready immediately. I didn't want to give Tiffany a night to rethink. Momentum is key in these interventions. If you give the addiction, whether it's to drugs or spending a chance to breathe, it will talk you out of recovery. She needed to be on that plane tonight. I checked in on them in the green room a bit later. The mood was somber. There was no celebrating. It felt more like a funeral for an old way of life. Tiffany was sitting in the corner, her expensive phone turned off and placed on the table, a symbolic surrender. Linda was holding Robert's hand, both of them looking 10 years older than when they arrived. I walked in not as the TV host, but just as a man who knows a thing or two about human behavior. You guys did good, I told them quietly. It was ugly, but surgery is always ugly. The healing comes later. Tiffany looked up at me. Dr. Phil, she said, her voice shaking. What if I fail? Then you try again, I said. But you won't fail because you can't. You have no safety net anymore. Humans are remarkably adaptable when they have no other choice. You are smarter than you give yourself credit for, Tiffany. You've been using your intelligence to manipulate. Now you're going to use it to build. Imagine what you can do with that same energy if you point it in a positive direction. She offered a weak smile. It wasn't much, but it was real. 6 months later, I sat in my office reviewing updates on past guests. This is the part the audience doesn't always see, but it's the part I care about most. The file on Tiffany landed on my desk. I opened it with a mix of anticipation and caution. The recidivism rate for this kind of entitlement is high. Old habits die hard, especially when those habits are funded by someone else. The report was interesting. It wasn't a fairy tale. Tiffany didn't become the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. She didn't magically pay back the $20,000 overnight, but the first line of the report made me smile. Subject successfully completed 90-day program. She stayed. She didn't walk out. She scrubbed the toilets. She worked in the kitchen. She lived without the phone, I read on. After the program, she didn't move back in with her parents. That was the condition. She moved into a small studio apartment, a far cry from the luxury condos she used to demand. She got a job, not a glamorous one. She was working as a receptionist at a dental office. $14 an hour. It was humble work. It was real work. There was a letter attached from Robert and Linda. Dear Dr. Phil, it read, we have our daughter back. She is different. She is quieter. She is tired a lot because she is working full time. But when we see her, she pays for her own coffee. It's a small thing, but to us it's a miracle. We are slowly rebuilding our savings. We are going to be okay. Thank you for giving us permission to say no. I picked up the phone and called them. I wanted to hear it in their voices. Linda answered, sounding brighter, lighter. We talked for a few minutes about their progress. Then I asked, how is she really, Linda? Is she happy? There was a pause. I don't know if she's happy in the way she used to think of happiness, Linda said thoughtfully. She misses the trips. She misses the shopping. She talks about it sometimes. But she's proud. Last week, she showed me her paycheck. She held it up like a trophy. She said, Mom, I earned this. I think she's finding a new kind of happiness, a quieter kind. That right there is the gold. Happiness built on consumption is fleeting. It's a sugar rush. Happiness built on competence, on self-reliance, that is protein. It sustains you. Tiffany was weaning herself off the sugar and learning to eat real food. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my chair. These are the wins. They aren't flashy. Nobody is winning the lottery. But a family that was spiraling into destruction had corrected its course. A young woman who was a parasite was becoming a citizen. Parents who were hostages were becoming free. It reminded me of why I do this. It's not for the ratings, though. Those are nice. It's for that moment when the light bulb goes on, when the denial cracks, when people realize that they have the power to change their own lives. They just need the courage to stop doing what isn't working. Tiffany's story isn't over. She will struggle. She might slip up and charge a purse she can't afford. But the difference is now she knows the cost, and her parents know their role. The system has changed, and when you change the system, you change the outcome. I looked at the monitor on my wall, the feed from the studio where the next family was walking in. Another crisis, another drama, another knot to untangle. I adjusted, my tie stood up, and headed for the door. Let's go do it again, I muttered to myself. Because the truth is, we are all just one bad decision away from chaos, and sometimes you just need someone to look you in the eye and tell you to get real. That's my job, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.